The grey maze. The fog clung to the Vosges mountains like a living thing, transforming the familiar pine forests of eastern France into an alien landscape where sound travelled in strange directions and distance became meaningless. Staff Sergeant Audie Murphy pressed his back against the cold steel of the disabled tank destroyer, its massive gun barrel pointing uselessly into the grey void that had swallowed their world. January 1945 had brought the worst winter in decades to this corner of the war, and now nature itself seemed determined to hand the Germans every advantage. The TD had thrown a track 20 minutes ago right at the junction where two logging roads met, the exact spot their convoy needed to hold while engineers cleared the main route ahead. Murphy could hear the distant rumble of German armor somewhere in the mist, but whether it was half a mile away or just beyond the next stand of snow-laden firs remained anyone's guess. The fog played tricks with every sense, making whispered commands sound like shouts, while swallowing the clank and growl of approaching panzers. "This is goddamn suicide," muttered Private Kowalski, hunched in the foxhole they'd scraped from the frozen earth. "Can't see Jerry, can't call for support, can't even tell which way is back to our lines." The radio operator's hands shook as he adjusted dials on equipment that seemed to pick up everything except the frequencies they needed. Static crackled with fragments of German voices, American call signs, and the electronic ghosts that haunted winter battlefields. Lieutenant Morrison crawled over from his position near the road, his face grey beneath the camouflage netting draped over his helmet. The young officer had been with the 3rd Infantry Division since Sicily, but nothing in 2 years of combat had prepared him for this kind of blind confusion. "Battalion wants us to hold this junction until the engineers finish," he said quietly. "But if we can't see what we're holding it against..." Murphy studied the abandoned tank destroyer, its crew having bailed out when the mechanical failure left them sitting ducks in the middle of the crossroads. The vehicle's main gun was still operational, and its machine guns remained loaded. But without mobility, it had become more liability than asset. Yet something about its position nagged at him, the way it commanded both approaches, the way its thick armor could absorb punishment that would shred infantry in seconds. The first mortar rounds began falling with methodical precision, walking up the road toward their position like a giant testing each step. German forward observers somewhere in the fog were calling in fire on sounds rather than targets, but their technique was getting more accurate with each adjustment. Murphy felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came before contact, the way his body prepared itself for decisions that would have to be made in heartbeats rather than careful thought. "They're feeling for us," he said, more to himself than to the others. "Probably got patrols moving through those trees right now, trying to figure out what we've got here." The fog that concealed German movements also hid American positions. But Murphy understood that advantage would evaporate the moment shooting started. Muzzle flashes would light up the grey landscape like deadly beacons, revealing locations to enemy gunners who were already plotting firing solutions. Kowalski's radio suddenly crackled to life with a transmission from Company B's positions a mile back down the mountain. "Heavy armor moving through Sector 7, request immediate withdrawal authorization." The signal dissolved into static, leaving them with fragments of information about a battle they couldn't see and orders they couldn't confirm. Murphy realized they might be cut off already, holding a road junction that no longer mattered in a fight that was reshaping itself by the minute. The fog seemed to press closer as machine gun fire erupted somewhere to their left, too close for comfort, but too distant to pinpoint. German voices drifted through the mist, calling coordinates and commands in a language that sounded harsh and urgent against the muffled landscape. Murphy checked his rifle one more time, though he'd cleaned and loaded it 3 times already, the ritual helping to steady hands that wanted to shake and a mind that kept calculating impossible odds. "Whatever happens," Morrison said quietly, "we buy time for the engineers. That's the mission. But his voice carried doubt about whether any of them would live to see those engineers finish their work, or whether the junction they were dying to hold would matter once the fog lifted and revealed what the Germans had been doing in the grey maze around them. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The fog transformed every shadow into a potential enemy position, and every sound into a threat that seemed to come from all directions at once. Murphy moved carefully along the tree line that bordered the crossroads, using the massive pines of the Vosges Mountains as cover, while he tried to map the German positions by ear alone. The snow beneath the trees had frozen into a crust that cracked underfoot, each step threatening to announce his location to listeners who might be mere yards away. Behind him, the disabled tank destroyer squatted like a wounded animal at the heart of the junction, its crew compartment empty, but its guns still capable of devastating fire if someone was willing to operate them. The vehicle's tactical radio had been damaged in the track failure, leaving Morrison's squad dependent on Kowalski's infantry set for communication with higher command. But the atmospheric conditions that created the fog also played havoc with radio waves, turning clear frequencies into corridors of static and confusion. "Movement, 2 o'clock," whispered Corporal Brennan from his position near the road's edge. The veteran rifleman had survived Anzio and the drive through southern France, developing instincts for danger that kept him alive when younger soldiers made fatal mistakes. Murphy froze, listening to the subtle sounds that filtered through the grey landscape. The scrape of metal on wood, the careful footsteps of men trying to move silently through snow and fallen branches. A German patrol emerged from the fog, like ghosts materializing from another world, their winter camouflage making them nearly invisible until they were close enough to count. 4 soldiers moving in tactical formation, probing the American positions with the careful precision of veterans who understood that the fog cut both ways. Murphy could see their breath as white vapor, the way their weapons moved in practiced arcs as they cleared each potential ambush site. The patrol leader raised his hand, stopping his men just inside the tree line, while he studied the abandoned tank destroyer through binoculars. Murphy realized the Germans were conducting exactly the same reconnaissance he'd been attempting, trying to understand American positions and strength without revealing their own. The fog that concealed movements also prevented either side from calling for artillery support, turning the engagement into an intimate contest of small unit tactics. Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, barely audible through the static. "Engineer, estimate 40 minutes to completion." "Whatever it takes, we hold until then." 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours, given their tactical situation, but Murphy understood the arithmetic of war that lay behind the order. Hundreds of American vehicles were stalled on the mountain roads behind them, sitting ducks for German artillery if the engineers couldn't clear the obstacles. The German patrol began moving again, working their way closer to the crossroads with professional competence. Murphy tracked their movement through the fog, noting how they used terrain features and the limited visibility to mask their approach. These weren't the green replacements Germany had been feeding into combat during recent months. These soldiers moved with the confidence of men who'd survived winter warfare and understood how to use conditions like this to their advantage. Kowalski's radio suddenly erupted with an emergency transmission from battalion headquarters, the signal clear enough to understand, but probably audible to German listeners as well. "All units, enemy armor concentration building sector 6 through 9. Expect major attack within 1 hour." The news confirmed Murphy's worst fears about their tactical situation. They were holding an outpost in front of a German offensive that would sweep over them like a tide. The fog began to thin slightly near the ground, revealing the frozen ruts and shell holes that marked the crossroads as a place where previous battles had been fought. Murphy could see equipment scattered in the ditches, abandoned packs, ammunition boxes, and the darker shapes that marked where men had fallen during earlier actions. The Vosges Mountains had become a graveyard of small unit actions like this one, where soldiers died for road junctions and hilltops that appeared on no strategic maps. A machine gun opened fire from somewhere in the grey void, its muzzle flashes creating brief moments of visibility that revealed German positions before dissolving back into concealment. The bursts were aimed at the tank destroyer, testing American responses and trying to provoke return fire that would reveal defensive positions. Murphy realized the probe was about to become a full assault, and the fog that had been their protection was about to become their tomb. The disabled tank destroyer suddenly represented more than abandoned equipment. It was the key to holding the crossroads if someone was willing to climb into its exposed turret and operate guns that would draw every German weapon within range. Murphy studied the vehicle's position, calculating fields of fire and survival odds, while machine gun bursts continued to probe American defenses through the thickening fog. The machine gun fire intensified as German probes developed into coordinated attacks, muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the grey landscape of the Vosges Mountains. Murphy watched from his position near the tree line as enemy soldiers used the fog to advance in bounds, appearing and disappearing like phantoms who materialized just long enough to fire before melting back into concealment. The tactical situation was deteriorating faster than Lieutenant Morrison could adjust his defensive positions. "They're coming from 3 directions," Brennan reported over the radio, his voice tight with the strain of tracking multiple threats through limited visibility. At least squad strength, maybe more. The veteran corporal had positioned himself where he could observe the main approaches to the crossroads, but the fog made accurate counts impossible. German voices echoed strangely through the mist, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere as enemy soldiers coordinated their advance. The abandoned tank destroyer sat in the middle of the junction like bait in a trap, its thick armor absorbing rifle fire that would have been lethal to infantry. But Murphy realized the vehicle represented more than protection. Its 76mm gun could dominate both roads if someone was willing to operate it from the exposed commander's position. The crew had bailed out when mechanical problems left them vulnerable, but the weapons systems remained functional. Kowalski's radio crackled with fragmented reports from other positions along the mountain front. "Breakthrough at Hill 342, request immediate reinforcement," and "lost contact with Charlie Company." The transmissions painted a picture of German attacks succeeding across the entire sector, turning their roadblock mission into part of a much larger battle. Murphy understood they might be fighting for more than just 40 minutes of engineer time. A mortar barrage began falling with methodical precision, the shells impacting in a pattern designed to isolate the American position from potential reinforcement. The German forward observers were good, adjusting their fire despite limited visibility to create a box of explosions around the crossroads. Each impact sent frozen earth and metal fragments sleeting through the air, forcing the defenders deeper into whatever cover they could find. "Morrison's hit!" someone shouted from the direction of the command post. Murphy saw figures moving through the smoke and fog, dragging their wounded lieutenant toward better cover behind the disabled tank destroyer. The loss of their officer at this moment couldn't have come at a worse time, leaving squad leadership to fall on whoever was willing to make decisions under fire. Murphy realized the responsibility was shifting to him, whether he wanted it or not. The fog played tricks with sound and distance, making the approaching German armor seem like ghosts rumbling through another dimension. Murphy could hear the distinctive clank and growl of tracked vehicles somewhere in the grey void, but whether they were 100 yards away or 500 remained impossible to determine. The acoustic environment of the Vosges Mountains in winter created echoes that bounced off rock faces and snow-laden trees, distorting every audio cue. Private Henderson, the squad's youngest member, crawled over with news that changed everything. "Engineers say they need another hour, maybe more. Something about frozen ground and broken equipment. The radio message meant their 40-minute mission had just become a death sentence, holding an exposed position against overwhelming force with no realistic hope of extraction. Murphy felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came before impossible decisions. The German attack developed with professional competence. Infantry advancing under covering fire while armor moved into position to support the final assault. Murphy could see muzzle flashes through the fog marking enemy positions, but the defenders were outnumbered and outgunned by margins that made conventional tactics suicidal. Yet someone had to buy time for engineers working desperately to clear roads that hundreds of American vehicles depended on. Kowalski's radio erupted with an urgent transmission from battalion. All units fall back to secondary positions. Repeat, authorized withdrawal to phase line blue. But Murphy realized the order came too late. German fire had already cut off their retreat routes, leaving them trapped at the crossroads with no choice but to fight or surrender. The fog that had concealed their positions now sealed them into a pocket of ground they couldn't abandon. The disabled tank destroyer suddenly represented their only chance of survival. If someone was willing to climb into its turret and operate weapons that would draw concentrated enemy fire. Murphy studied the vehicle's position and the advancing German forces, calculating odds that made no mathematical sense, but somehow felt necessary anyway. The fog was lifting slightly, revealing shapes and movements that confirmed their worst tactical fears. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The fog began to thin as German armor emerged from the grey landscape like prehistoric monsters awakening from sleep. Murphy could see the angular silhouette of a Panzer IV through the mist, its gun traversing slowly as the crew searched for targets among the American positions scattered around the crossroads. Behind it, more shapes moved in the fog, infantry following their armor in the kind of combined assault that had driven Allied forces back across the Vosges Mountains in previous engagements. "Jesus Christ," whispered Henderson from his foxhole near the road's edge. "How many of them are there?" The question hung in the air as more German vehicles became visible through the lifting fog, revealing the true scope of what they faced. This wasn't a probe or a local attack. It was a concentrated push designed to break through American lines and exploit the gap that winter weather had created in the mountain defenses. The abandoned tank destroyer squatted in the middle of the junction, its 76mm gun still pointed down the main road where German armor was advancing. Murphy realized the vehicle represented their only chance of stopping tanks that would otherwise roll over infantry positions like a steamroller crushing ants. But operating the TD meant climbing into an exposed turret that would draw fire from every German weapon within range. "Somebody's got to get on that gun," Brennan said, voicing what everyone understood but nobody wanted to acknowledge. The tank destroyer's crew had abandoned it for good reasons. Mechanical failure had left it immobile, turning the vehicle into a stationary target that would attract concentrated enemy fire the moment its weapons came to life. Murphy studied the distance between his position and the TD's rear deck, calculating survival odds that made no sense by any rational standard. The German advance continued with methodical precision, infantry moving in bounds while their armor provided covering fire. Murphy could hear orders being shouted in harsh syllables that carried clearly through the thinning fog, revealing enemy coordination that spoke of veteran troops rather than the green replacements Germany had been feeding into combat. These soldiers knew how to use terrain and weather to their advantage. Kowalski's radio crackled with desperate transmissions from positions across the sector. "Need immediate artillery support," and "falling back under heavy pressure." The messages painted a picture of American defenses crumbling all along the mountain front, making their small roadblock action part of a much larger tactical disaster. Murphy realized they were fighting for more than time. They were fighting for the lives of hundreds of men caught in traffic jams on mountain roads. The first German tank reached effective range and opened fire, its main gun sending a high explosive shell into the tree line where American positions were dug in. The blast showered frozen earth and splintered wood across the crossroads, forcing defenders deeper into whatever cover they could find. Murphy felt the concussion wave slam into his chest like a physical blow, reminding him of the killing power that would be focused on anyone operating the tank destroyer. Without announcing his intention, Murphy sprinted from cover toward the abandoned TD, crossing open ground in bounds while German small arms fire tracked his movement through the fog. Bullets cracked past his head and sparked off the vehicle's armor as he reached the rear deck and scrambled toward the commander's hatch. Every instinct screamed at him to find cover, but something deeper than training drove him into the exposed turret. The tank destroyer's interior was cramped and cold, filled with the diesel smell and mechanical complexity that marked American armored vehicles. Murphy found the gunner's position and began traversing the 76mm gun toward the advancing German armor, his hands working controls he'd studied but never operated under combat conditions. The fog outside was continuing to lift, revealing targets that had been hidden minutes before, but also exposing his position to return fire. The first shot from the TD's main gun erupted like thunder in the confined space, the muzzle blast clearing a corridor through the fog and revealing the German tank it had targeted. Murphy saw his round impact the Panzer's frontal armor in a shower of sparks that indicated a ricochet rather than a penetration. The enemy vehicle immediately swung its gun toward the tank destroyer, beginning a duel that only one crew would survive. German machine guns opened fire on the TD from multiple positions, their traces creating deadly light shows in the grey landscape while bullets rang off armor plate like hail on a tin roof. Murphy worked frantically to reload and aim while enemy fire sought the vision blocks and weak points that would let death into his steel shelter. The fog that had been their protection was almost gone now, revealing the full scope of what one man in a disabled vehicle was trying to accomplish against overwhelming odds. The tank destroyer's machine gun came to life under Murphy's hands, sweeping German infantry positions with long bursts that sent enemy soldiers diving for cover. But he could feel the vehicle shuddering under impact as German weapons concentrated their fire, testing armor thickness that wouldn't hold forever against sustained assault. The fog was lifting completely now, exposing him to every enemy gunner in range, while revealing just how alone he really was. Inside the tank destroyer's turret, Murphy felt like he was fighting the war from inside a steel coffin that rang like a bell under constant enemy fire. The fog had lifted enough to reveal 3 German tanks advancing on his position, their guns swiveling toward the disabled TD with mechanical precision. What the official reports would later call extraordinary valor felt like terror and desperation, mixed with the simple understanding that running meant watching his squad die. The secret that would never appear in any citation was the moment of pure panic when Murphy realized he was trapped. The tank destroyer's systems were more complex than the training films had suggested, and German fire was methodically destroying vision blocks that left him increasingly blind. His hands shook as he worked unfamiliar controls, trying to traverse the main gun while machine gun rounds sparked off armor that seemed thinner with each impact. "Murphy, get out of there!" Brennan's voice carried across the crossroads as the corporal provided covering fire from his position in the tree line. But Murphy understood that abandoning the TD meant watching German armor roll over positions where Henderson, Kowalski, and the wounded Morrison waited in foxholes that offered no protection against tank guns. The mathematics of survival had become brutally simple. One man's life balanced against 6. The 76mm gun fired again, this time catching a German tank in the side where armor was thinner. Murphy saw the enemy vehicle shudder to a stop, smoke beginning to pour from its engine compartment as the crew bailed out into the snow. But two more panzers were advancing, and German infantry was moving to flank the TD from positions the main gun couldn't reach. He was winning a battle he couldn't possibly survive. What the after-action reports would describe as single-handedly holding off enemy armor felt like a series of desperate improvisations interrupted by moments of pure terror. The tank destroyer's machine gun jammed at the worst possible moment, leaving Murphy to clear the stoppage while German rifle fire sought gaps in the armor. His movements became automatic, driven by training that operated independently of conscious thought, while his mind struggled to process what he was attempting. The fog lifted completely as the third German tank maneuvered for a shot at the TD's vulnerable flank. Murphy traversed the main gun with agonizing slowness, knowing he would only get one chance before return fire turned his steel shelter into a steel tomb. The enemy gunner was good, working his own controls with professional competence, while machine gunners provided covering fire that kept Murphy's head down at crucial moments. The duel lasted seconds that felt like hours, two main guns seeking each other through the grey landscape, while infantry on both sides provided supporting fire. Murphy's shot struck the German tank's turret ring, just as the enemy fired, both rounds finding their targets in the kind of exchange that tank crews had nightmares about. The enemy vehicle slewed sideways and stopped, but Murphy felt his own TD shudder under an impact that spider-webbed vision blocks and filled the fighting compartment with smoke. German infantry rushed the damaged tank destroyer from three directions. Their assault coordinated to overwhelm the single defender before he could bring weapons to bear. Murphy worked the machine gun like a man possessed, sweeping the advancing soldiers with fire that sent some diving for cover, while others kept coming with the determination of veterans who smelled victory. The fog had become patchy now, revealing movements and positions in brief glimpses. The machine gun ran dry as German soldiers reached the TD's flanks, their grenades clanging off armor, while small arms fire sought vision ports and the commander's hatch. Murphy found himself fighting from inside a steel box that enemy soldiers were trying to pry open like a can, their voices clearly audible as they worked to find ways inside. This was the moment that wouldn't appear in any official account, when heroism became simple survival instinct. But Brennan and Henderson had used the time Murphy bought them to reposition with captured German weapons, catching the assault troops in crossfire just as they thought victory was within reach. The attack faltered as enemy soldiers found themselves caught between the TD's guns and rifle fire from positions they'd thought were suppressed. Murphy heard American voices shouting encouragement and coordinates, turning his solitary stand into a team effort. The German withdrawal was as professional as their attack, falling back under covering fire, while Murphy continued to engage targets through damaged vision blocks. But something had broken in their assault. The tank destroyer they'd expected to destroy quickly had held its position long enough for American infantry to reorganize and resist. The fog that had concealed their approach now covered their retreat back into the Vosges Mountains. When Murphy finally climbed out of the tank destroyer, his hands were shaking so violently he could barely work the hatch mechanism. The vehicle's armor was scarred by dozens of impacts, its vision blocks shattered, and its machine gun position blackened by muzzle blasts. What struck him most was the silence. After the thunder of tank guns and machine gun fire, the mountain crossroads felt unnaturally quiet. The aftermath felt stranger than the battle itself. Murphy sat on the tank destroyer's rear deck, cleaning his rifle with hands that still trembled from adrenaline and delayed shock, while medics worked on Morrison and the other wounded. The fog had lifted completely, revealing a landscape that looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, snow-covered trees, gentle slopes, and mountain vistas that showed no trace of the violence that had swept through them. Henderson approached with a canteen and a quiet word. "Engineers finished 20 minutes ago. All convoys moving through now." The young soldier's voice carried a mixture of awe and confusion as he tried to process what he'd witnessed. Behind them, the rumble of American vehicles echoed through the mountains as hundreds of trucks, tanks, and artillery pieces rolled forward on roads that had been bought with blood and terror. The tank destroyer would be written up as a total loss. Track damage, transmission problems, and battle damage that made it cheaper to abandon than repair. But Murphy realized the vehicle had served a purpose its designers never intended, becoming a stationary fortress that turned one man's desperate stand into a tactical victory. The fog that had nearly gotten them killed had also concealed their small numbers from German forces that might have overwhelmed them with different tactics. Kowalski's radio crackled with new orders as the tactical situation shifted across the Vosges Mountains front. 3rd Battalion moving through phase line blue, enemy withdrawing to secondary positions. The transmissions painted a picture of American forces advancing on schedule, filling gaps in the line that German attacks had tried to exploit. Murphy understood their small action had been part of something larger, though he doubted the connection would ever appear in official reports. Lieutenant Morrison, propped against a pine tree while medics bandaged his wounds, managed a weak smile. "Battalion's putting you in for something significant, Murphy. Don't know what yet, but this won't go unnoticed." The young officer's words carried weight, but Murphy felt only exhaustion and the strange emptiness that followed extreme danger. The fog was gone, but its memory would linger in ways that citations and ceremonies could never capture. Brennan walked over to examine the tank destroyer's battle damage, counting impact marks that told the story of Murphy's fight from inside the turret. 47 hits on the armor, he reported quietly. Any one of them could have gotten through if they'd hit wrong. The veteran corporal's voice carried understanding of how thin the line was between heroism and tragedy, how small differences in angle or timing separated survival from death. The German equipment scattered around the crossroads would be collected by Graves registration teams and intelligence specialists, turned into reports that analyzed enemy tactics and capabilities. But Murphy found himself thinking about the soldiers who'd operated those weapons. Young men, not much different from Henderson or Kowalski, fighting for a cause they might not understand in a place far from home. The fog had made enemies of people who might have been friends under different circumstances. As the convoy continued rolling through the mountain pass, Murphy realized the tank destroyer had become something more than abandoned equipment. It squatted at the crossroads like a monument to the afternoon's action, its scarred armor and silent guns marking a place where ordinary men had done extraordinary things. The fog that had nearly killed them had also created conditions where individual courage could matter more than numbers or firepower. Years later, when Murphy tried to explain what happened in the Vosges Mountains to people who hadn't been there, he found words inadequate to convey the reality of fighting from inside that steel box while fog and enemy fire turned the world into chaos. The official accounts would mention his conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty, but they couldn't capture the fear, the confusion, or the simple determination to protect the men who depended on him. The fog had lifted from the mountains, but Murphy carried its memory with him, the way sound traveled strangely through grey landscapes, the feel of unfamiliar controls under hands that shook with terror and adrenaline, the faces of enemy soldiers who'd seemed like ghosts emerging from another world. Combat had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it, making impossible decisions in situations where hesitation meant death. The tank destroyer sat silent in the afternoon sunlight, its mission complete and its crew long gone. Snow began falling again as evening approached, covering the scars of battle with a clean white blanket that would hide the evidence until spring thaw revealed what winter warfare had left behind. Murphy shouldered his rifle and followed his squad down the mountain road, leaving the crossroads to winter and memory. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.